All right, Marina. So
I already forgot the question.
The question is, what are some of the failures? Let's say the three biggest failures that you experienced when you were in architecture school or shortly afterwards that redefined your thinking, that shaped your thinking.
It's funny, like everyone just keeps trying to bring me back to architecture school.
It could be after architecture
when
school.
I've escaped it. Well, let's start with school, maybe.
Don't tell us that you had no failures.
No, I'm sure I had plenty of failures. I've just never really looked back
because
on
there's
them.
so few. That's right.
No, I mean, let's see. Failure in architecture school. I mean, I don't know if there were failures or just kind of like misunderstanding of things.
Excuses? I wouldn't call that a failure. It's just had bad instructions.
I mean, I would say maybe things that I would have done differently, and I don't know if therefore they're failures.
Yeah.
In studios maybe the first couple of years of studios, because it was a new thing, right? Like you've never done that before. You get the assignment, you get a project. I think I was maybe too worried about the project brief and satisfying that rather than maybe having more fun and exploring things.
Okay.
And that probably comes from like, again, having homework to do in high school and just wanting to do the homework well, right? I feel like maybe that limited my answers and my projects in some ways.
What do you mean by you were limited by the project brief? What does that mean?
I think I was probably focusing too much on like the program, the square footage and the things that were demanded in the project brief, rather than thinking about bigger creative picture of what the project is about.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Because, I mean, in the first year of architecture, you don't really know what you're expected to produce and to create, right? So you kind of follow like the guidelines that the teachers give you. I think I was probably also too worried about the final product, the final project. But again, I feel like it's probably normal in the first couple of years.
Too worried about the final product?
Yeah. Yeah, make sure you have a model that's complete, that looks good, that, that you have all of your stuff the day of, like, rather than, I don't know, just having fun and exploring, and maybe the model doesn't look great, but the idea was awesome, you know?
So what have you learned from that failure?
To worry less about what people think.
To worry less about what people think?
Probably. Yeah, probably.
No.
And that it's not so much about responding to it's not so much about, and at least in school, about responding to the question. It's about how you're responding to the question. It's not really about the answer. It's about how you're responding to it.
Expand.
Well, it's not so much about making a beautiful model. It's about, is the project interesting or not? It doesn't matter if the model is beautiful. If it's a basic answer, it's a basic answer.
Gotcha. Right. So if you become too preoccupied with satisfying all of the checkboxes that are in the program, but also you become too concerned with having something that is really well executed and has all the drawings you're supposed to have, and they're drawn the right way,
that's not enough.
and the model is clean and all those things. If you focus on that, but you're sacrificing the creative part of the process, and in that part of the process you are looser and you're exploring, and there's a good chance you're pushing the limits of what feels comfortable, and you might not even arrive at a good solution, but you're giving the space for that, right, in the creative process. If you don't allow you that space and you focus too much on the execution, then you've missed out on, I suppose you've missed out on part of the education, and you've probably missed out on designing the thing also.
Yeah, but looking back to like at those like like reviews, I'm actually, my memory is fading, right? I'm actually not sure that teachers were promoting so much the quest for an interesting answer rather than, do you have everything you were supposed to have today?
Really?
Yeah. Like looking back, I'm not sure that was very strongly I mean, in the later years of school, definitely more. But in the first few, I'm not sure.
Well, so how does one, let's say a person finds themselves struggling with in the same way, what advice would you give?
I don't know. I mean, I still believe that you should have some of the stuff that's required for you to have, because I don't think it's
Yeah.
good to just be like, well, I'm still working on it and I have none of this stuff there. Or like, it probably comes down to time management and like be like, okay, well, you know what, the last week I'm just gonna have to produce the stuff that is being required. But up until that point, I give myself freedom to try as many things as possible, as freely as possible, and question everything. That would probably be my advice. It's hard though, because you don't really know which route is the best one.
Yeah.
And at some point you have to pick a route if you are trying to produce the stuff that you're supposed to have the day of.
I mean, I think creating a calendar for oneself, it makes sense and it's very fundamental, right? And it sounds obvious, but even if you don't know how things are going to go and you've never been through the process before, and therefore it feels very silly to try and sit down and make a schedule. Because if you try to make a schedule for something you've never done, you're like, well, I don't know. I'll just make up something. But it's still worthwhile. So obviously you do have a deadline if you're in school for any project, because there is a deadline, and you just work backward from that deadline. And even if the schedule you've created is off by 30%, it's okay, because then you go through it and then you find out I was off by 30% while you're in the project, or afterwards when you're looking at the project in retrospect, and then you adjust the next time. And that's kind of the best you can do.
Yeah.
And or asking advice from others on how long it takes them to do stuff and when they do things. And on that note, I don't think I've ever heard a single student ever ask a teacher or a fellow student, in private kind of social conversations out on the deck by the studio or in class or anywhere, about creating a sketch. The only time it's happened is when it's part of the class. So it's not really perceived as a schedule. It's more like, okay, class, you have the final presentation is at the end of the quarter. Okay. And I'm the teacher, and, I'm talking about the teachers I had, and we have 4 assignments before then. But in a student's mind, because you're focusing on, finishing the assignments and then getting to the final, you don't perceive those assignments as being chapters in the larger schedule. You just see them as assignments.
Yeah.
And I think the only time that there was, like, when I was teaching, I had my students create a schedule. I said, this is the final show. Everyone on your own create a schedule, and I'm going to review it with you. And then I would look at it and say, oh, it's unrealistic. This is realistic. I think you have to account for like holidays in your schedule. Like you didn't do that, stuff like that. And even if they ended up being really off, the reason why it's helpful is that now you have data, right? You're collecting data for the next time you do this. And you can look back and say, okay, I was off by these amount of days in this part of the process. And but I was close in this part, and this next project I'm doing is different, right? Now it's a library that's bigger instead of doing, I don't know, a school, or maybe the same size, but they're different programs, but you have something to work with. It's the same thing in an office. Like if you have an office and you're running an office, and let's say you're a new office and you're trying to figure out the schedule, or you're trying to figure out fees, that's another one, right? And you've never done it before, you're like, I don't know what to charge. So you talk to colleagues, and or you do your best to try and calculate it, right? And the value of that is more for the future. So if you're tracking your time and keeping track of all those things over the course of, and this lifespan in an office, after 5 years, 10 years, whatever years, you have a lot of data to look back on. And based on the data that's been recorded, this is how long it's going to take, this is how much it's going to cost, X, Y, and Z. If you don't have that data and you never tracked it, good luck. You won't make it. You won't make progress regarding those aspects nearly as quickly. So the same thing applies for a student, in fact. And it's kind of odd. Like, I don't know why schedules and deadlines and micro deadlines and being organized, so to speak, is not more. I can see where maybe first and second year it's not so much, because you just want people to just explore. But once you get to doing buildings and end of third year, fourth year, I feel like there should be a lot more conversation, like structured conversation about it. Like have a calendar, have it, like I would have the students, like it needs to be printed, or written down. Like it's a physical artifact and it's pinned on the wall, and you're going to look at it, every day, every week, and check where you are. Not a vague of, oh, how's it going, Danny? Oh yeah, I'm doing good. Are you gonna start the model? Yeah, maybe next week. Okay, cool. Like that's not that's not how you run a project. So in fact, I think in the academic space, teachers and students could probably learn from what it means to run an office.
Well, and I think also a lot of students, don't struggle with the creative part, but do struggle with the time management part.
Yeah.
And sometimes they have the project, they just didn't get to execute it or finish executing it in order to present it, which is kind of stupid, because if you have a great idea but you really were short by 4 days, that's kind of silly, right? Like you could have had an awesome project and presentation if you had those 4 days, but how would you know where you were if you never tracked it?
And that's, I think, part of the struggle of when you are a student, or let's say you're a sole proprietor and you're by yourself. The two are kind of the same because you're on an island by yourself with everything that you do. That it's, I find, for me at least, like the stress of working, the stress of allowing oneself to be creative or to not be creative is when you don't have clear partitions of time, right? If you say it's a psychological trick, let's say, or tick. Like if you say to yourself, okay, I have this 1 week, and I know this 1 week I'm giving myself full authority to be creative, to question anything and everything in this 1 week for this aspect of the project I'm designing, right? And I have that 1 week. Then during that 1 week, I'm kind of relaxed because I know I've told myself this is all I have to focus on. And then I just say to myself, after that week, then we move on to the next thing, and then it's a different task, let's say. And then it goes on and on and on. If you don't do that, though, which students don't, then you're constantly flipping mentally between, should I be doing this? Should I be doing that? Should I be creative? Should I be doing the model? And you don't know because you haven't created a clear set of time for yourself. So it is sort of a trick if you say okay, no, this is my time. I'm giving myself time to do this. Then you can. It's like life is much easier because you're not plagued by the little voices saying, well, I don't know if you should be doing this. I don't know if you should be doing this. Like you've already cut that stuff out. I think that's very. It's very helpful. It's very helpful.
So what are some of your failures?
Well, it's funny you mentioned that your failures early on in school had to do with being too focused on completing the assignment. Let's kind of call it that way. Because my failure was the complete opposite. I did not care about completing assignments. And as you might imagine, therefore, I did not complete many assignments. I was one of the students who...
Yeah, but I bet your work was probably more interesting than mine in the end.
I always felt, being as objective as one can be, that the projects I did, all of my own projects had an interesting idea to each of them. Like there was something there that was of interest. At least it was interesting to me, and I was excited by it. It always and expressing the idea and the fundamentals of design, that was fine. But in that last layer of finishing the project and getting it to the next level of refinement, and also just completion of the documents you're supposed to have, I always had a really, really, really hard time getting there. Extremely hard time. We should have
teamed up.
Yeah. So, and looking back, the reason for that is I was a perfectionist, to to an unhealthy degree. Obsessive. I don't know if obsessive compulsive disorder would be part of that category, but when I think back on it now in school, there's definitely something within me as a person, or maybe as part of the environment or whatever, that was not, it wasn't good. It wasn't productive. It wasn't healthy. It wasn't physically or mentally healthy. It was really just kind of perverse and
I have an idea where that comes from.
Yeah. And it took a long, long time, honestly, for me to recognize with as much with clarity that this is not, it doesn't work.
Did you realize that while you were still in school or after you got out of school?
I think I was aware of it when I got to my later years in school. And it became really clear not until maybe years after graduating. It's kind of different. So the one thing I'll say real quick is it's very different school and practice. So in school, again, you're so much left on your own to figure out things. In practice, it's incredible how quickly a lot of that brain power effort goes away because you don't have to think about that. Like you're just given a task to do, especially when you are young in an office and you've just graduated. You're not given the responsibility of project manager where you have to, or whatever title, when you have to keep track of a lot of different things. You're kind of given smaller tasks, even if they're broad in design. It's like come up with a concept design for a school. Like that could be a task when you graduate, which is a big task, but it's still like very focused in a sense. And so a lot of the skill sets that one should have or you're trying to gain in school, which is to manage everything on your own and manage yourself on your own, you don't have to do it in an office. So therefore, I think it took quite a few years after graduating before I could look back and like understand, like, and that also why I was always very intrigued with teaching, because it's like I feel like I could have had a few people, teachers who could have really helped me if they had said certain things or structured things differently, or knew how to design a building to begin with. That would have been useful instead of just being academics and saying wacky stuff. But so I struggled with completing stuff because I was a perfectionist and I always got stuck in like the early concept design, like early concept design phase. And I've said it before in here.
But stuck in like a way, like in a positive way.
No. What do you mean a positive way?
Like you were interested by that, therefore you were staying within that phase?
Yeah.
Or you had issue getting out of move on from that phase?
It's both. Oh. I loved being in that part of it, the thinking. And when I say concept design, I don't mean concept design in the professional sense.
Yeah.
I mean concept design as in like the core concept design that you would think about more in an academic setting. Like the ideas, the concept of it, right? And the party and this and that and the research like that, I was more fascinated with, or rather I got stuck in, and I could never close the gap between that and then the final execution. I liked both, but getting from one to the other was always a challenge.
Oh yeah, I mean. Mostly
because I didn't actually, when I think back, it was probably because I didn't have structure. Like I didn't have structure, and I don't know, again, I was a perfectionist. Like I would just get stuck, doing, let's say, diagrams or something.
Well, I think it is probably the hardest step in what we do is going from like the idea to the building.
Yeah.
Like that's...
So...
That is the big question mark. That is the hardest part.
Yeah. And so my advice and what I'd learned from that as a way to get out of that, if you're one who's stuck in those early ideation phases, is to, not for the entire project, not for the end of the quarter deadline, but just for yourself, for the span of a week or 2 days or a week and a half or whatever, just choose a direction and just go with it. And suspend disbelief for yourself as a design perfectionist, meaning to say that you know that this direction has flaws. You know that when you put your pen to paper and you've drawn this wall and this space, that it's not great and it doesn't make sense. But you are going to ignore that it doesn't make sense. You're going to ignore all of the things you know that are wrong with this scheme. The way design works is you have, let's say it's sort of like a body. There's like a skeleton, right? Which is the primary conceptual structure of the scheme, the design structure. And that skeleton is, let's say, the concept, and it's the party and this and that. And then you have layers and layers upon that to final execution and then final aesthetics and whatever else. And let's say when you're pursuing the scheme, you know that there's something flawed with the core skeleton, this core concept, like there's something off with it. But you have to choose to ignore it and just go. Because what happens is when you build up a certain set of information, you've completed this design to a certain degree, maybe not the final degree, but the certain degree in that week and a half. Only then can you learn from it. If you get to a certain like checkpoint. Like you're trying to get a checkpoint, and then you can look back and then redo all the stuff you did. So this is another thing I talk about very often, is design is not a... See, my mistake also was not thinking, but trying to make each of the design steps perfect before moving on to the next.
Yeah.
And you can't do that. Like you can't find the perfect idea, the perfect partie before you move on to the next phase. It just, you'll never finish, you'll never finish anything. So what you do is you go 3 steps forward, right? And then after you complete that, you look backward on the last week and a half of work and you say, okay, there's some core problems with the idea, but there's other bits I learned along the way that make sense. Then you redo the stuff and you do 3 steps forward and then 2 steps back, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. So you're constantly like editing the project and redoing the project. That's another big key takeaway, is you have to like move forward past your comfort zone and then redo it again. And then forward to the next level of completion past your comfort zone, because you know you haven't solved all the first few phases, and then redo them again. And that's the way you do it. It's sort of like if you're writing a paper, if you try to write the perfect opening paragraph to a 10-page paper before you get to the second paragraph, like that's crazy. No one writes that way. It's impossible. And the same thing has to be applied to design, right? You write the first paragraph and then you plow forward the next like 5. Then you go back to paragraph 1. You say, okay, now because I have more knowledge and it's written down, I can critique all 5 of those paragraphs and the first one and redo the whole thing.
That is very much your approach of a perfectionist still, though. And I could see how you could also keep getting into that loop and never really get out of it, you know?
There is some of that too. There's some of that too. So that's what I would say, you know, for students who are, or young designers who are struggling in that way, like just move forward, man. Just go. Don't just don't worry about it. Just go, you know, and then redo it because you've given yourself the schedule and the time to redo it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's very interesting. Like you do have to push the idea a little bit further in order to, you know, keep pushing it forward or kill it, right?
You also can't. You don't know whether or not an idea is valid unless it goes forward enough.
Yeah.
Like you can't stay in the conceptual diagram sketch mode to test the idea. You can't test an idea, you know, to really know if it works like that way. It's not possible.
Yeah, that's interesting.
All right, so tell us your second failure that you've experienced early on in your academic career, later on in your academic career, or as a young professional.
I would say later on in school, probably. I think by the time 5th year came, like I feel like I became more in tune with what I was interested in. Mm-hmm. And who I was and all of that good stuff. But 5th year was hard because I was pretty organized, but I had a really hard time. I had too many ideas. Mm-hmm. You know, like I was very interested in the subject. I've always been very interested in like the research and doing analysis of things and understanding and questioning and all of that stuff. Mm-hmm. And I think my wish list for my project was maybe too broad and not focused enough because of all of those interests. Mm. So I think that was one of the issue and maybe still sometime to this day it's still like that. Like I'm so interested in so many things that it's hard for me to just stick to one. Mm. And sometimes I'm forcing, like even in terms of design, like I love all kinds of different designs and architecture and colors and feelings and atmospheres and all of this stuff. So sometimes I'm forcing myself to just like stay within that lane because I could just go in too many different directions. Mm-hmm. So that was one of them, and I don't know if I have an advice on how to go past that.
Yeah. Let me interject. So I feel like what you're saying, and this happens with thesis in particular, when it's a year when you're asked to sometimes for the first time really think on your own. Yeah. For a project that's not hyper structured by some tortured step-by-step process the teacher has prescribed. It's also almost always the first time that as a student you're asked to think on your own as a person, like, what are your interests?
Yeah.
You know, even if everyone has the same site, it's like, but what are your interests, architectural interests, and even personal interests, and how does that feed into? Yeah, the thesis is so closely tied to the individual person that it becomes a process of self-reflection, and that is a very incredible but also dangerous path to have to go down. And I think when you open that and you look inward properly, then there's a bunch of stuff, and it's really hard to.
Yeah, no, it was really hard. I mean, like the site that we had was like this very complex site. The topic that I chose was more of an urban topic than like an architectural one.
Yeah.
So that opens up the door to like so many questions and so many things.
Yeah.
Where if I had gone the route of, other of my peers that were like, I'm designing a civic center.
Yeah.
And that's my project.
Yeah.
I'm just responding to designing a building that acts as a civic center.
Yeah.
And that's it.
Yeah.
It's very focused. It would have been very easy.
Yeah.
My thing was like, well, how does the building like interacts with the surrounding sites and the impact on like, like the urban scale and all of that down to like the human feeling when you're inside the building and like all of the things. And I think I just...
But shouldn't the civic center people also be asking the same questions?
No, they should. But, you choose your route when you're in fifth year, right? You could decide if you want to focus on designing a beehive for bees that only exist in one region of France that only go to that specific flower. You can,
Did someone do that?
No, I'm just being like ultra specific, right? But like you can go down to like the extremely precise niche
Very
topic
focused.
if you want,
Yeah.
because you're free to choose what your subject is about in some ways. So yeah, I think that was probably my biggest struggle, and somewhat, maybe where my project failed is that I was trying to accomplish too much.
Okay, so you went from one problem to the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of problems. Your first issue when you were starting off was you focused too much on completing and executing everything, and then in the end you focused too much on the why questions and not completing everything.
No, I did complete everything in the end. Like I had my model, I had my boards, I had
don't brag.
The plans, like everything was there, but maybe the project didn't feel like it was pushed as far as it could have gone, because I probably spent too much time exploring all of the things that I wanted to explore.
Gotcha.
And didn't really like get a chance to actually push the design a little bit.
All right. I'm kind of giving you the stink eye here because it's like, what's your greatest failure? Well, I had so many great ideas and I completed all of the work, but it just wasn't as good as it could have been.
No, but the thing is, my project wasn't the best one in the end, right? Despite me completing all the stuff. And that's probably because I had put too many things on my plate to begin with.
Okay. So your failure is that you weren't the best in the class. That hardly qualifies as a failure. Fuck you.
That is not what I'm saying, but that's how you interpret it.
We had, I think you and I were very different students in school, 100%. But we always had students in the class who, on the opposite ends of the spectrum, like students who completed everything on time. They were clean. They like probably smelled good,
That was me.
And then you had students who were like morphing and becoming one with the couch that was in the studio, and that was probably more like me. And the students who were clean were always asking questions about like, I don't know about this part of my design. I'm like, I don't even have drawings. Like, you look at they have a pen with all this stuff. You're like, I think that line weight's a little bit off. And I look at my board, there's like a sketch. I'm like, shut up. You don't know my pain. So, but I think I understand what you're saying, though. In particular, when it comes to thesis, you get plagued by so many questions. I think that is a trap with thesis. If you, again, as I said at the beginning of thesis, do it properly, and you are looking inward, you become exposed, therefore, to a bunch of different ideas, and it becomes this very personal quest, and it's easy to get lost or not find your direction or be consumed by all of these things. I think the antidote to that would be to realize that the project you're doing will be one of many projects. And this is something we talked about with, for some reason, I recall the conversation with Tristan Eaton, because, and it stuck in my mind because it's him, but also because he's not an architect, and it was shocking how many of the same steps and process and ways of thinking that he experiences and does himself, like exactly, like almost said exactly the same way as an architect like myself or another architect would describe it, both a bit more style. So I think that's part of the challenge of being a younger designer, is that you have all these questions and ideas, and there's a tendency to want to cram more of them into a design than they belong. And then later on, once you've done enough projects, you realize like, I've done a bunch, there's more to come. I don't need to force this thing, this interest, this whatever into the project. I'll just save it for later, and if it happens, it happens, great. If it doesn't happen, then it doesn't happen. Because there is one thing that all designers and artists, anyone who creates something that they're looking for, is clarity of the statement. Yeah. That's the one ultimate truth with anything anybody creates, is the clarity of the statement.
If you can summarize a project into one sentence.
Yeah. Like, what is it doing, and is it doing it? That's really what it comes down to. Yeah. And what it's doing can be very complex, confusing, ugly, monstrous. It could be whatever types of descriptive words, but it needs to have clarity still. And that's fundamentally what it is. And I think as one matures, the work tends to become clearer, because partly you're not forcing things. When you're younger, you're just trying to get it out. You have all these ideas, you want to get them out on paper, and partly I think it's because you're excited, like you want to get it out there, but you can't force it. Like, if it doesn't belong in that project, don't shove it in the projects, right? And that's a really hard. And I say that as some advice, I suppose, but it's hard to do. That's where I think just doing a lot of projects is helpful. Like, just go. Like, don't do one, do 10, right? And it allows you to kind of just get those things out. It's like you're fidgety almost with too many ideas. Just then put them out there and for where they belong quickly.
Any other ones from your time in school?
In school? I'll transition to the profession. School and in the profession is that I was not trusting of anybody. I didn't trust anybody or their opinions. And I don't know, to be honest, if that's a flaw. I didn't trust anyone's feedback at all. I had a few friends who I trusted as people, and I liked their work, and they were smart. But I would very, very rarely ask anyone for their opinions on my work. I didn't trust them.
I don't think I've ever asked anyone their opinion on my work either. Like, what do you think of my project?
Peers to peers, yeah, that's pretty common. I mean, I think it's common for people not to ask, but I also never ask teachers so much. And when they volunteered, I don't care. I didn't care. I was like, I don't care what you think. I really don't want to hear what you think. And I don't know. It's not a great point to bring up, because I don't have any advice for that or things I learned from that. I don't know. It's just, I didn't trust them.
Find a partner that gives you input without you asking.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I don't know. Like, the teachers would say stuff, and I would just remember thinking, like, I don't believe anything you're saying. I fundamentally disagree with what you're saying. And I think part of the struggle was that as a person who is creative, as many architects are, not all, but many of them, you have your own way of thinking and your own kind of path to go down in terms of design process, let's say, specifically. And the studios are more and more structured so that they're not accepting of this alternate, not even alternate, but just like one's own way of doing things. And like, I was talking about this the other day with somebody who's teaching, and I said, I would have projects, and let's say the brief was design maybe it was, I don't know, we designed this center for the creation of this humanoid robot right? So it was like part factory, part museum, part this and that, as is a school project, like all these different kinds of things. And I had a very specific idea of like what the narrative of humans versus robots meant, and how that could be expressed in the project as a moment in the project. And that was the first thing it came up with. It wasn't I wasn't like seeking to create, to decide as to think about this idea in the sketch as the first thing. It just happened, right? Like, I don't know where, this was a thought, but I was completely, intrigued by this idea of this relationship, how it could be expressed through a facade or like through a moment or whatever. And that was like where I wanted to start with, because it just felt that's what I found. That's what I found in my researching and sketching. But the class was structured so that, no, this week we're looking at, I don't know, structural design, like the actual structure of the building or whatever. And I'm like, but I don't want to start with designing my primary structure. I want to start with this idea. And that was always the problem I had, is that the studios always had this structure as a way to keep students on track. But then anytime I had an idea outside of that, like I couldn't. And when you are captivated by an idea and it gets planted in your brain, and you try and pursue, and you want to pursue it, you really can't. You don't really have a choice but to pursue it. Like, you can't ask someone like, Dad, don't think about that idea you've had. Just focus on this other thing. It's like really hard to ask someone to do that when they are dedicated to what they're doing.
Well, it's also hard to have a class or studio structured in a way that, okay, everybody, like 25 students or whatever, this week we're looking at this all at the same time. And like, I mean, as we all know, everybody has their own process of creation. It's not like step 1, look at structure. Step 2, look at floor plan. Step 3, look at facade. Those are things you have to look at, but in whatever order it's most natural to your process.
Yeah.
And it does require more work from the teacher side, because that means that 25 students in the class are probably each going to be looking at different things every week, and you have to be able to like make sure that they move along. Yeah,
but if you actually know what it means to go through designing a building, it's not that big of a deal. The fucking problem is a lot of teachers don't actually know what it means to go through designing a whole building from start to finish. So they have to make up these apparati, I don't know, these mini structures and this American Ninja Warrior games to go through as a way to have structure, because they have no other way to teach.
Yeah.
Right? If you're a teacher, you don't actually know how to design a building, like a building and have a concept and all that stuff. You can't teach students like what I was describing and have 25 students like you were talking. You can't do that.
Yeah.
Because you wouldn't know what to do. It's just, so yeah, that was, I don't know if it was a failure, but that's something that I really, 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 really struggled with, big time. And I think the failure that came out of that perhaps is transitioning out of school is the biggest mistake I made once I graduated and I was in different offices, is I didn't ask enough questions. And maybe it's in part because I was used to not asking questions or seeking help from anybody. Or it's because of pride and arrogance and one's own, personal faults. I don't know. But I didn't ask enough questions, and I should have asked more questions.
Yeah.
Well, obviously the solution is to just ask more questions. I will also say, though, I think part of the environments and times that I was in when I was a very, very young professional was that everyone was severely underpaid. I mean, making half of what graduates make now. Half.
In best case scenario,
at best case. Like, you were lucky if you even got a full-time job. And if you did, it's like you were making $36,000 a year living in New York City. If you got a job. Most people didn't get jobs. You got internships and you were paid a subway card plus $100 or $500 a month. Yeah. So $6,000 a year. And anyone listening is probably shaking their heads. And anyone who's of our generation, they are shaking their heads and nodding because they went through that. That was the reality. Not a great reality, not good for the profession, a lot of problems in this and that. Also quickly say that's therefore when I meet recent graduates today and they're asking for whatever they're asking for, I'm like, what the hell are you talking about, dude? Like, I know it's expensive in X, Y, and Z cities, but do you think you're worth that kind of money? You're not. It's absurd. Anyway, so what I was going to say is I remember specifically when I was first starting off that I strongly felt that I needed to pretend like I knew more than I did as a way to secure a position where I got paid enough money. And I should not have allowed that to be part of thinking. I should not have allowed that to impact my openness to learning and asking questions and being proactive in that sense in an office. But that was I was always afraid, like if I show that I don't know stuff, I'm potentially going to be let go or not be hired, and I won't be making the 36 grand a year I need to survive or almost survive, right? And that was always there. And I shouldn't have, I should have not let that be part of the thinking. But I mention that because I do think when it comes to what's the phrase, feast or famine kind of mindset, when you're, your best hope is to make $38,000 a year. It's kind of like you do everything you possibly can to get that and then hold on to it. And for me, it was a sort of a survival mechanism that I should not have used, but it was a survival mechanism. I was just afraid. I was like, I can't ask that because I was hired under the pretense of me knowing X, Y, and Z things about construction or whatever else. And in retrospect, it's a mistake because, of course, you're only like 22
no,
or whatever.
They're not expecting
they know
you
you don't know anything.
They expect you to know InDesign and Illustrator and Revit really well.
But of course, at the time, you don't know how you're perceived when you're 22. Yeah. So you think that's why you play these mind games of like, well, I can't ask that question because, again, like, I need this job, or again, there's probably something in there having to do with pride as well. So you're correct. I mean, one thing to put folks' minds at ease of asking questions is like, look, if you're just graduated, you know nothing. We all know you know nothing.
Well, and that's also like an advice maybe I give to people is when you come out of. I mean, nowadays it's a bit different because the internet is more present than at the time where we graduated, and like I think asking for advice as you're coming out of school and starting to work for the first time to people who just did it or have done it a few years before you, like not being afraid to, like you said, like kind of like ask for help and advice rather than trying to figure it out on your own. I mean, we kind of did it on our own, but and it goes back to like this notion of networking and maybe like asking for advice to people you don't really know, like just reaching out to get help could be considered as a way of networking. And I know like, in France, it was never a good thing. Like, oh, you're playing favorites. Oh, you have connections. Oh, that's how you get into places and you get stuff and whatever. And that was always like kind of like a big no-no. And I wish, for example, I had reached out to other students who did the exchange program I did and stayed in the United States and be like, hey, how did you do it? Like, how did you get to find a job? How did you apply? Like, what are the things that I should be mindful of? What are the things red flags I should be aware of? Like, just, just get more information instead of doing all of the groundwork yourself because it could be pretty exhausting.
Yeah. Asking for help is a big one. It's probably not done enough in architecture, but I do think the younger generations are much better at asking for help because because we have, like, the podcast is out there. There's stuff out there.
There is resources. People are more open to give information and share information.
Yeah, and people are more there. I think also just inherently interested in asking for help, and it's all good. I think one of the other failures, not for myself, but I think I see it more and more often these days, especially because of social media and the internet, is for younger designers to just be too, how do I say it, to let their attention be too split up and fractured amongst different things. Like, I think design, and especially learning design, requires a lot of focus and solitude, and you need quiet, calm, uninterrupted, empty space to be in. And it's too easy now to be distracted by a bunch of different things, a bunch of different opinions, a bunch of different medias and music and movies and reels and all this other stuff. And you kind of need to give yourself clean space to just exist in, to think about stuff and to draw stuff. And I think for almost any architect who does design, they probably will also say the same thing, like in their own process. Like the best design thinking oftentimes comes from quiet space, where you're not, it's unadulterated. You're not being peppered with different things, and you're not being pulled in different directions by, again, other opinions. And that's a hard thing to do, but you have to learn how to do it, I think.
It's funny because I think that was one of my biggest struggle when I started working after school, because I used to spend pretty much all of my years in architecture school working alone.
Mm-hmm.
If I wasn't working with teammates on group projects, right, I was in my tiny studio with my computer, my ferrets and whatever, my models, all my stuff, and in my one room, like that's how I was working on my projects. I was in my head a lot.
Yeah.
Right. And it was very difficult for me working at offices where I had to be creative in an environment that really wasn't what I was used to be creative.
Right.
So that was a really big adjustment, and something in retrospect I wish I would have practiced during school. Like I didn't have like a desk in school. Like those were just like you grab whatever's available, but you couldn't leave your stuff. Yeah. It was so chaotic that I never pictured that I could be designing in those rooms because there's just too much happening.
Yeah.
So I always avoided that. And I think it was somewhat a disservice to myself when I started working, because you work in an office and there is 100 people around you. You have to design.
Yeah.
You don't have that mental space, bubble, comfort, environment. You're on a computer that, the screen's too small.
Yeah.
And you're sitting by the bathrooms, and you have someone else on the phone doing like CA on a project, and there is like somebody else having a birthday party in the office kitchen, or you have to, so noise cancelling headphones are probably the best thing I would recommend anyone to get.
Yeah.
But kind of like being able to shut off everything. Even in I think even in art school, when I took that gap year, even just having eyes on the creative work that you're doing as you're trying to produce it was extremely handicapping to me.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, I know I'm not the best one in the room. Like, I don't really draw as well as, everyone around me. So I don't necessarily want your look on my stuff as I'm trying to figure it out.
Yeah.
That just kind of like just blocks me from doing anything. And so those are the two things that I wish I had challenged a little bit more during my time in school to feel a bit more prepared, when I move into working for an office.
Yeah, I can understand that. I do think though that for most people, the very raw design process is a private thing. And so as an employer, you need to give people space to do that.
Yeah.
It's for most people, it's not going to be comfortable like designing in front of an audience. Like it doesn't feel, it's just human nature. You don't feel comfortable with that. And so I find when it comes to, working with employees or working with students, you have to be very sensitive with what their comfort level is. And so it is up to the office to understand that and then allow for space and an environment that allows for different types of design process to take place for people to feel comfortable. And that also probably includes not positioning people by the bathrooms and
that, or you have the tiniest desk that you can get in an office and you're like, I can't even fit an 8.5 by 11 in front of my keyboard.
Yeah.
To sketch. So are you expecting me to design a building?
It's so dumb.
What?
It's so dumb.
Oh, you can use the conference room. Yeah, I have to drag all my shit over. I don't have a computer there. It's like the setup is just not working.
I find that weird. I mean, I think, real estate's a premium in urban places like New York. So that's one thing. A lot of the work is now on the screen. So that's another. But, before all the drawings took place on vellum and mylar, on giant 24 by 36, 36 by 48 tables. And you always had at least that, if not another work surface next to you, because it was all physical and you needed the space. But I think that physical space it's very valuable. It's really hard to like to design a tower when you have only the space for an 8.5 by 11 in front of a keyboard, and you have to move your key? Like, it just, a small thing, it just doesn't make sense, right? Like, how the fuck are you supposed to design like this way? If I'm designing a bathroom, sure, but like if it's a tower, I
need elbow room, you know.
You need more space. It's almost like you need more thinking space too. Yeah. I'm trying to think. So what were some other things in the professional setting that, you know, were, I guess, failures that you made, or things you would have done differently?
I mean, you know, like, as you're a young professional, you know, when you work in like bigger offices, you know, like you feel like you don't deserve things because you're young and inexperienced, or have less experience, or you're one of the new people in the office that joined like maybe a year ago. Everybody else has been there for 15, right? It's just kind of like advocating for yourself, or asking for a raise, or asking to be move projects, or, you know, like asking things that you think would improve your learning experience, your career, you know. I felt like the first few years I was more like kind of like taking the back seat, and, you know, no, I can ask for that. Like, what? I started a year ago. I'm just a young designer. Like, I can be asking for a raise. I can be asking to do this. I can be asking for more responsibility. And then at some point, maybe you have a click, and because you see someone else in the office who did it, who started maybe after you, and they got that. So then you're getting pissed off. Because you're like, okay, you understand that if you don't ask for stuff, it's never gonna come to you. And then, you know, your perspective changes. But I did wish I was a little bit better at that at the beginning, or even like knowing how to negotiate, you know, your salaries. Like, I've definitely know that the first job I got, like, they got a great deal, you know, but again, I had no idea. And I would have never even tried to ask for more because I was so happy I could even get a job, right?
I mean, again, they were different times compared to now generally. So it's a supply and demand. It's a understanding of the market. Kind of situation. That's why now you get people asking for what I think are absurd amounts of money when they have no experience. Although I was speaking with an architect who has their own office, and they're saying it's actually swinging back because all those young graduates who are asking for like this X amount of money are realizing like no one's going to pay you that. So they've stopped asking. So yeah, I think that's a good one. I think the other failure, I suppose, is again more of a psychological one, was not committing to an office when I started off, and knowing, because I think I've always known I was going to have my own practice. I think I've also very clearly seen the shortcomings of all the offices I've been at, and it's again a psychological kind of mental shift that in order for you to get the most out of a working experience at a place, you need to commit to the office and give to that place. And if you allow yourself to be aware consistently of the office's flaws, and therefore, you know, I'm not going to be here for like eternity, that makes you disengaged from the office to a point potentially where you are therefore not getting as much from the office as you could be. And that was an issue I had too. I was never as committed as I probably could have been, because I knew I wasn't going to be there for 15 years and whatnot. I mean, there's a few occasions where I'm like, yeah, I'll give it a shot, but then I've never been, this is why we have our own practice. I've never been good at, just kind of, what's the phrase, turning a blind eye to the issues, when those issues come from the leadership.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that's not, and I know enough about groups and leaderships and whatnot, even at that time, to know like, it's not going to change. There's nothing I can do. If I'm out here for the next 25 years, I'm not going to change this aspect of the office. Right. And that's just it's a hard thing to do, to like know that, but then be like, oh, I'm super psyched to be here every day. Let's like fully commit to you.
I know.
When you feel like also you're being a little bit underpaid, it's like, it's a weird, but you kind of need to do that. You need to commit. And I think maybe most people don't have that problem. I think it's people who are destined to have their own practice have that problem. And that's probably why they start their own practice. So, A lot
I
of
think
people
it's the
don't have
level
that
of
issue.
satisfaction. I mean, you
Yeah.
know, like if you have 10 criteria to feel satisfied in office, but only 3 are being met, it's gotta be hard to commit.
Yeah.
You know.
What about like specific failures that were not, you know, errors in ways of doing things, but like, I don't know, did you miss a deadline? Did you make a mistake in a design and you realize you shouldn't have, or, you know, something like that?
Miss a deadline? No. No, I mean, especially when you work for an office because you're not the only one on it. So if you miss a deadline, it's the whole team who missed the deadline.
Yeah.
And you can't let that happen.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's people who are going to flake out and not show up to help you finish the deadline, but no, the deadline is met. As far as mistake on designs, that's a good one. And I'm not sure because...
It's not necessarily a design mistake. It could be...
I mean, on projects and stuff.
I'm thinking about that same question too, and nothing really pops to mind. I think part of it too is the projects take so long, and there's a lot of checks and balances in an office that things get resolved. Like even if you make a mistake or someone makes a mistake, someone else will catch it and it'll get fixed for the most part. Like I've never been a part of a practice where really big mistakes were made. You know?
Oh, we forgot the rebar in the concrete.
Yeah,
oh,
it's never anything like that.
Forgot the elevator in the skyscraper. Oh, no.
I mean,
No,
there's
not
always,
really.
of course, when you're designing something and it gets built, there's things turn out different in real life always, which is part of the magic, but also therefore potentially part of the quote mistakes that are made or things that you would have done differently. Like, that feels a little bit different than what I thought it was going to feel, or
Yeah.
you know, the sun is moving a little bit differently than what I anticipated, or I don't know, or whatever else. There's stuff like that, but you know, that's just things you learn from with experience in general. I mean, yeah, the biggest error for me was just not completing stuff. And the easiest fix in my case was to work with people who helped me fix. Actually, going back to the creating calendars thing. So when I was in school, I partnered with a friend of mine and we did this project together as a competition. And he was the one who was like, let's make a schedule. And I was like, schedule? We don't need a schedule. And he's like, no, we need a schedule. I'm like, okay, fine. And I don't know if
It's funny though because
we made it. I don't think we looked at it more than once, but I feel like it still did help.
it's funny though your struggle with structure and organization, because I feel like your mom is the most organized person I probably know.
Yeah.
But that did not get passed down to you somehow.
No, I don't. You know, I think
Although
part.
that's
I think
changed.
part of
That's changed.
not really. I think
no,
part
you're pretty
of
organized.
I think part of finding success with whatever you're doing is just being aware of your shortcomings. And there's some inherent shortcomings that you can try to overcome, or you can just work with people who are better at that, and therefore it's a symbiotic relationship, and it's fine. And that's the case for me. So you know, when it comes to like creating schedules and calendars, I don't have a problem in adhering to schedules, but making schedules and calendars and things like that, I can do. It's definitely not my comfort zone. And I don't know what it is. If I did more of it, I would get better at it for sure. But there's something about it. It just, I don't know how to describe it. It doesn't feel right. Like, this is weird, but like designing and a bunch of other stuff, it feels like bare feet on shaggy carpet. It feels good. When I'm trying to make a schedule, it's like I'm walking on a beach that has a bunch of shells and big rocks. It doesn't feel right.
Do you like puzzles?
I despise puzzles.
That explains
I think they're
why.
stupid.
That explains why.
What do you mean by puzzles? Like
Any types of puzzle, like puzzle with pieces, puzzle
Okay.
like word puzzles, like just puzzles.
I like riddles, but puzzles, no, I don't.
Yeah, so
I
you're
don't
definitely
like them.
never gonna be a schedule guy.
I don't like puzzles. I just feel constrained, and I feel it's just stupid. It's a dumb task. It's like, how can you do this as quickly as possible, even though it's a defined outcome? Like I have no interest in that. That's stupid. Well, complete this 1,000-piece puzzle of a cat. No.
Yeah, you see, I found that fun. So.
No, it's disgusting.
The cat or the puzzle?
It's just both. It's just no. Yeah. So yeah, something about. So that's what I'm saying too. I think like, you know, witnessing and being aware of the failures and learning how to overcome them or correct them in the future is great, but also just being aware that there's some things that you will find over time that you're probably not as good at as other people, just inherently.
But so do
That's
you
fine.
feel like you've changed since your failures in school? Or you feel like you're still carrying those failures with you somehow?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the tendency toward the obsessive compulsive manner of working, it's almost, I'm not an addict, so I don't want to make an unfair comparison, but it's sort of like being an addict in that it's always there. And part of what I have to do to get through designing a project is keeping that in check and not allowing it to get to a weird place like it used to get to. And that...
like have more control over it.
Yeah, exactly. And again, I think setting up structure and then telling yourself like, let go of that, right, is a helpful hack. Like I was also obsessive when it came to the execution of the final thing as well. Thinking about it, I'm perfectionist with everything. So when it came to making a model, like if there was meant to be a clean edge, it had to be perfect. It had to be. And I would cut this piece, I would buy $30 worth of material and cut it 50 times if I needed to get it perfect. And that's great if you're a finished woodworker. But if your first job is to complete the work, it's not helpful. Like,
you see, I wasn't quite like that.
Yeah.
I would do a good job at cutting. It would be clean. It would be cleaner than everyone else in the studio, but it would not be perfect.
Yeah. Okay.
And
okay. So
and that would be enough for me to be like.
Okay. So it wasn't perfect, but it was still better than everyone else.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I mean, well, no, but like, meaning to say, you don't necessarily always have to look for perfection, as long as you're already doing better than everyone else.
Yeah. See, that's where I still don't. I still don't agree. I don't agree with that. I'll keep myself in check, but I don't agree with that. I had, I mean, there's a lot of examples of this, in fact, but I had this one model where there were these columns at an angle that were in the model, and the model was at a scale, so they made V's, and you could use wood dowels, small wood dowels for some of these things, and cutting it at the precise angle, the two pieces so they met perfectly, that was relatively easy to achieve. But I had these other columns that were too thin to be made out of wood, so I had to use wire. And one could bend the wire to make a V, but then at the joint, it's incorrect because it's not like that. So
it's not good. It's incorrect.
It is incorrect. You're correct that it's incorrect. And you could use pliers to cut it, but then that's not a clean edge.
But it's still incorrect.
It's still incorrect. So I think I used a wire cutter to cut it, and then I would file it down to what it needed to be. Would. But beyond that, it's metal and looks like metal. So I was like, okay, I'm going to paint it with acrylic paint to look like wood. Fine. It's not easy to get the correct shade to match the rest of the wood.
5 years later, the model is still in progress.
It's also very important that you use the right type of brush so that the strokes match the grain of the wood.
Yeah, but you see, at the end, what matters most, that all of those things are to perfection, but there is no model being made, or that they're better than everyone else, and there's actually a model to be looking at. Think about that.
What's important is being correct and not incorrect.
What's important is to be able to look at the thing you're trying to make so you can improve on it rather than figure out the perfect path to get there but never get there.
If it's correct. No, but so this is the type of thing, right? I was just, it was a problem. It was like almost like an addict's behavior. Like I just could not let go of whatever the thing was. I'm trying to think of other examples that came to mind, but
but you act like that just for architecture. Like, is that something else that you apply to your like daily life? Not really. So you see what I'm saying? Like, you are able to let go perfection in other parts of your life and your existence, but you're not so much able to let that go for architecture. So
no, because it's incorrect. It's very, when it comes to execution of stuff and craftsmanship, to me it's black and white. It's either right, and there is a limit, of course, right? Depending on the scale of what we're talking about. If you're doing a building and it's off by a millimeter, then it's
By
fine.
a millimeter, it's gotta be off by at least 1
The
millimeter.
thing that drives me nuts with buildings is like, foundations. Foundation guys only want to work to like 4 inches or 1 inch. I'm like, no, fuck that. You're gonna pour the foundations down to what I say it is. If it needs to be 1/8 of an inch, then you make it 1/8 of an inch. What does your tape measure not have 8s? Of course it has 8s. Put the formwork where it should be.
But it doesn't make a difference.
It does make a difference.
Like, oh wow, did you see this foundation? It's 1/8 of an inch bigger, but it's perfection.
Yeah,
Nobody's the worm in the dirt won't notice.
No, but sometimes, it has ripples effects to everything else, and then like, oh, we'll make up the difference later on. Like, no, we won't. You'll do your job right.
Yeah, it depends if it's a foot off versus an eighth. Like,
Yeah, of course. We were in a building not long ago, and we were viewing the work done by the contractor and their subs, but the mechanical room. And a mechanical room, right, is kind of like, it just needs to perform. Like, who cares? It does matter once you get to a certain scale of house. In our case, like when the houses get really big, then mechanical room needs to be tidying. Otherwise, it gets really confusing.
I mean, it helps for maintenance too.
For maintenance, like all this stuff, right? When it's small, you can kind of hack it together. But anyway, this mechanical room for this fairly sizable project was super well done. And it's something that craftsmen people would nerd out about, because it's like, yeah, they get it, They get it. Even if it's just a mechanical room, it's just a crawl space, it's just the framing, it's just the foundation, whatever. When people take pride in their work and they do it, maybe not to the degree of what I would like, but close to it, it's like there's a level of appreciation and craft with that. And I think that it's a very, 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 very important thing. And I think part of where that comes from for me, the obsession with technique is probably to do with my music background, where perfection is what you have to strive for. You just play the same thing over and over and over again until it's perfect.
I think it has to do with who your dad is.
It could be that. It could be that too. But there's this famous pianist, and I forget his name. And he would rehearse, like all musicians, hours and hours and hours every day. And he was asked by an interviewer, like, why do you do this? Like, and his thing was, I had to practice X amount of hours in a week, or X amount of hours, I think, every day. And the interviewer said, well, if you missed an hour, like, really, at this point in your career, you're at the peak of your career, maybe just past that. Like, you've had a full career. Like, what difference does it make if you miss a half an hour of practice, right? And his response, I'll get the times wrong, but his response was, if I miss half an hour of practice, I'll know it. If I miss, an hour of practice, the orchestra I'm playing with will know it. If I miss 2 hours of practice, the audience will know it. But that half an hour matters the most. And it sounds like a crazy person, but like that's what it is. That is what it is. And so I don't know. So yeah.
Yeah, no, it's that's interesting. It's interesting.
My models were very clean but incomplete.
Yeah, your models are in pieces.
Yeah. So no other thoughts about like failures with things as opposed to processes and ways of thinking? It's a tough one. I can't think of any like mistakes, I guess you would call it in a sense.
No, I mean, going back to the puzzle and the fact that you don't enjoy puzzles, like that's just not how your brain works or anything like that. I think mine is very much the opposite. Like I found pleasure in puzzles,
mm-hmm.
and there is a danger to that. There is a danger to that because you can just keep playing the puzzle and never get out of the puzzle, right? So. I would say maybe in like talking about things and not processes, or maybe kind of both. Like you're talking about your obsession with, models and perfecting the models and the techniques and all of that. I think I'm probably similar, and like floor plan exercises because I found them very satisfying, and I could get trapped in just doing that, and that's it. And it's definitely not the only way a project can be looked at, and it's definitely not validating everything for a project. And it's easy to just keep refining it, keep trying something slightly different, and do like 150 different options, and not knowing at the end like which one was actually the most meaningful, because you've looked at it for so long in so many ways that the puzzle is just a big blur.
Yeah, I think that's part of the challenge of being any person who creates things. I think any person who makes stuff has designs and creates things has that same problem, and it's in a sense, it's also just tunnel vision. When you are working on something consistently a lot, you just lose bigger perspective. That's why working with people is almost necessary.
It is, and I think also when you find something that you like doing, like your research for perfection or the perfect cut or and just get trapped into that. I think that's where like something that brings you joy is also like becomes a torture in the end. Like you actually end up just torturing yourself if you get stuck in that realm.
Well, I think the other takeaway from that is giving oneself breaks. Like everyone needs a relief from the thing you're doing to do better at that thing. I was working in an office, and one of the folks I was working with was very adamant about that, and I think I've mentioned this before in the show. Clients would ask for a schedule, a very fast deadline, and he would be like, no.
Yeah.
And the clients would be like, what do you mean no? Like, we'll pay you more to do it. He's like, no. He's like, because we need time to think. And that was his answer. It wasn't, I like the answer, and it's always stuck with me, because it wasn't him saying, well, we have to pay our staff overtime, and then we have like software things, and then we have, then it takes time to talk to consultant. It wasn't anything, he wasn't really explaining. He was just saying, he was explaining, but also not explaining, like, we need time to think. And that's what it is.
No, and that's a very valid answer that I wish every architect would use more often.
You need time to reflect and think about what's happened.
And I think that's also one of the, like some of the failure that architects face is that they comply to clients' demands sometimes too much. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't, because a client is a client and that's what they're hiring you for. But I think not pushing back enough is something that we don't do that often, as architects.
As a profession.
Yeah. Like saying, I need more time. Like, I can whip out something, but I need more time.
Yeah.
Like, that's not how it works.
Yeah.
If you want something done tomorrow or like right now, just ask me Journey and you get it in 2 seconds.
Yeah.
But you're asking me to do it, and I need more time.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's time to do the work, but it's also time to do nothing. Was the amazing part about the answer.
I think that's one of the biggest failure, I think, for anyone who's dedicated to this profession, or if you have a business, or if you're like very committed to the project you're working on, is the failure to never stop, never turn off your brain, never allow enough breathing room for the machine to restart and to reset and to work at its full capacity. It's like pushing yourself to exhaustion is too common.
Yeah, I think that bleeds over into work-life balance, we can call it. But I'm also thinking jumping between projects is helpful. Like if you work on this one project or this one part of the project for, a couple of weeks in a row, you depending on who you are, you therefore need a couple of days or a week or half a week away from it to come back to it. And, from a client's perspective, one could say, well, so you're telling me that my deadline is pushed to, December instead of October or instead of September because you need half a week to do nothing? It's like, yes. Yes, that's how it works. That's how it works. Because this is not number crunching, right? It's not a set path. It's not like you can just grind, and then it'll produce something good. Like the relief is incredibly. Yeah. I'm trying to think of an analogy or something, but it's incredibly important. I mean, in a certain sense, you could compare it to working out or training as a musician. Like, you do need breaks, or your muscles of any athlete, any physical performance, you need a break for the muscles to recover. In the case of designing something, you're not necessarily mentally recovering, but that's part of it too. It's also just, there's another space in the back of your brain, and I'm sure there's some kind of biological term for this, where the brain is still working on it, even if you're not consciously thinking about it. And a lot of progress can be made during those 3 days of, quote, doing nothing and not thinking about it. It's an odd,
or just looking back at the
thing
3 days later with fresh eyes. You might just have a completely different perspective on it.
Yeah. I think that's critical. The last thing I'll mention, which it was a failure in the moment, but it's more of a way to bring about a new topic potentially for another recording.
Oh, look at you.
Is when I was a third year student, I completed this project and I did an okay job at completing it. The design I thought, was kind of interesting. And during, I think, Christmas break, my parents were like, "Oh, you should show it to grandma and grandpa because they would find it interesting." And so my grandparents were Chinese, but very American. So it wasn't a cultural barrier, was what I'm saying. So I hooked the computer up to the TV. I put up the presentation, and I started talking to them about what I did and why I did it. And, Christmas break as a student is like right after you're done with the project. So it's all very live and fresh and exciting. So I'm talking, and I look over, and I think my grandpa fell asleep, which was sort of to be expected, but quite deflating. And my grandma was awake and listening, but she did not understand a single word I said. And she was extremely smart. Again, there's zero language barrier here and zero cultural barrier. And my grandmother, she was a really smart person, and she spoke better English than I did, and she was more well-read than I was, more worldly than I was, all this stuff. But she was like, "Oh, that's nice." And that's not a typical response for my grandma at the time, because, again, she's a smart person. She wasn't like an old grandma who was out of touch with everything. And that's the only thing she can say is, "Oh, that's nice. Do you want cookies?" It wasn't like that. But she said "Oh, this is nice." And then she didn't understand a single thing. And so you could say, that presentation was a failure, I suppose. But the takeaway from it was, I realized that when I made the presentation to my peers and my teacher and the critics, they seemed to understand it well enough to have feedback, right? So therefore, some of the reason why this didn't work could be because I wasn't good at presenting, but it would seem to be because everyone else in the school understood it, that it had to do with something else. And
was it because the ideas were too abstract?
It was just, I think it was just, I didn't have a way to explain the project to a non-architect. And that was probably the very first time where I realized, and I was deflated in the car ride afterwards, because it's so I spent all of this time, this entire quarter, working on this project, not sleeping, doing all this work, deep diving into research, having all these conversations with the teacher, the peers, really in it, to end up with a finished product, roughly, and to end up with something that the outside world doesn't understand and therefore won't care about at all. And it was pretty eye-opening to feel that. And that, in fact, is, I think, the core issue with the entire profession, is that people don't know what we do. And probably since that time, I've always had in the back of my mind that question of, is this, at the time, is it because of me? Or is it because, I'm using the words I learned at architecture school. I'm speaking the way we all speak in architecture school.
Yeah.
So what has happened here? I didn't realize I was learning a new language. I didn't realize I was learning some new religion that no one gets. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that is a tricky thing to overcome.
Yeah, that is pretty interesting that you actually had that experience while you still were in school. Because I think that became, I don't think I've ever presented projects to my parents. I don't think. Or if I did, it was just like, oh, look at my beautiful model. Oh yeah, beautiful model. But like the whole like conceptual aspect of it, I think I also never expected them to understand it, so I never bothered.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that you witnessed that within the time you were a student, because I think it was made more clear to me like after I started working, you know, or like you start
speaking with clients.
You know, you sit down in client meetings and you see that the client just doesn't understand what the idea was behind the stuff, and you're like, but it was pretty clear. There's drawings, there's perspective, there's materials, there's, you know, diagrams and all of those things, and they don't know how to read a plan. They don't understand like what that words mean, and I mean, you really have to kind of tailor the presentation to the audience. Yeah,
and some of that falls on the responsibility of the clients too. Like some clients, they pay attention, and even if they don't have a creative bone in their body, like they're paying attention, so they start to get it and they're engaged. Other clients are just like, they're not paying attention, and that's their own problem. So it's an odd thing, because I don't want to talk about the solution so much in this recording, but I think like you said, you have to choose your words and structure them in a manner that makes sense for the audience, always. I do think, though, it's a mistake to think that you only have to create the presentation from the perspective of the audience. I think it's an important thing to talk about stuff that you know the audience probably won't understand if it's important to the project. You have to, of course, try to explain it and not write it off as being, unreceivable. But I think we get into dangerous territory if we, reverse it too much.
Yeah.
Like you have to say what's important, even if they don't get it.
Yeah. If
you have this grid, and the grid is interesting because of whatever architectural history, you should talk about that. So
you don't have to dumb it down because it's an audience that's not an architecture audience.
No, I don't think you have to dumb down the ideas. You might have to dumb down the words or just use alternate words, but that's part of it. Closing this gap that we've talked about a lot, right? Like you can't do that if you change your language so much and you remove portions of the design presentation, then you're not helping.
You're not helping the profession.
Yeah. You're not closing that gap.
Yeah.
All right. That's it. Any other things? I'm good. Okay, cool. Give us an outro.
Thank you, everybody, for listening to this episode. If you like what we do, please subscribe, follow us everywhere you can. We are on social media, Second Studio Pod on Instagram. You have the website, secondstudiopod.com. We are also on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many other podcast platforms. You can subscribe, rate, leave us a review. We also have the hotline, 213-222-6950. You can send a text message or leave a voicemail if you have any questions like this listener or any topics.
Yep. Keep going.
Any guest suggestions or anything you want us to talk about, please reach out. And that's it. Got a lot more coming up, so, keep
stay
listening.
tuned. Yep. Okay, thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.